It's safe to say this story begins with the Muffin Men. That's right, before Cloud9 was Cloud9, they were actually a group of rogue, professional Rocket League players looking to make it big and show how good they truly were on the biggest scale of their life, which was actually DreamHack Atlanta in 2017. Now you should know that the reason the Muffin Men were called the Muffin Men was because of their fearless leader, Squishy Muffins. Yes, the Muffin Man, Squishy Muffins, had already made a name for himself at this point, amassing a pretty decent following on YouTube for those who like to watch high-level, stylish, and sometimes outlandish Rocket League plays. This was a player who consistently hung with and sometimes absolutely embarrassed the best of the best in the competitive Rocket League scene, but he hadn't quite had his shot yet. He did sub for G2 for a time, but never managed to break through into their main roster, and now he was on his own with two other relatively unknown professional players in Torment and Gimmick. Now these guys were all friends, and they were confident they could make a dent in the Rocket League esports scene just with their pure skill and abilities. Now the Muffin Men had been on a bit of a tear going into DreamHack. This was one of the few Rocket League teams that could really hang with those teams who had already been signed with an org. You almost never see this kind of thing in Rocket League esports or really any sort of formal sports. But every now and then in Rocket League we see a group of guys getting together who are just insane, and for whatever reason they can hang with the guys who are making like six figures on an actual team playing for an org, even though they're not really making anything and they're just a group of guys playing. The Muffin Men had been on a tear, like I said, with the former thrown together team Iris. That's the team that sort of predated the Muffin Men. But Squishy and Torment left Iris to form this team with the Gimmick, who is actually the sub for Iris. Again, one of Squishy's close friends, and thus was born the Muffin Men. Iris had had similar dominance in smaller tournaments, but they had failed to really prove themselves as they weren't able to qualify for league play of RLCS, and they'd actually lost to multiple teams that they should have beaten like pretty easily. So at DreamHack Atlanta, this is a live major Rocket League tournament, we finally got to see Squishy's face. This basically was his face reveal, and his demeanor was, well, it was basically how we expected. Cloud9, they did really well during the group stages, only losing to Gale Force. That's really the dominant team from that era, and you're going to want to remember that team, Gale Force, which was made up of Turbo Pulsa, Violent Panda, and K-Dop. But then the Muffin Men sweep NRG in the first round of playoffs, then they take out G2, which takes them directly to the grand finals against, you guessed it, Gale Force. So this series goes all the way to Game 7, and as time was winding down, the Muffin Men actually win the series on this really sad own goal. So after this incredible win, it was announced shortly afterwards that the powerhouse esports org Cloud9 was picking up this roster to make their first Rocket League team and to have really their first debut in the Rocket League esports scene, and it would actually end up being their only Rocket League team throughout the whole time that they were involved. Now this was a big deal, having a huge org like Cloud9 join Rocket League. Obviously NRG is a pretty big org, but Cloud9 jumping into the Rocket League scene sort of validated it as an esport at this time. Now Cloud9 was dominant in North America for their first season of RLCS, dropping only one series and ultimately becoming the regional champion in North America. So it looked like they were on a fast track to at least playing in the grand finals of RLCS Season 4. At least that was kind of the hope for Cloud9 fans. But that just didn't happen, and though Cloud9 would go on to having, pretty solid performances in the future, they were sort of plagued with an inability to really play to their full potential when it mattered most at Worlds. In Season 4, Cloud9 lost to Method in the losers final, just one series away from the grand finals. Squishy may have hit one of the greatest shots ever to basically happen in RLCS history with this ridiculous ceiling shot that had a fake thrown in there, but still this just wasn't enough. Cloud9 had kind of a lackluster season by their standards in Season 5. Though they did make it to Worlds, they ultimately lost out again to Dignitas. That's sort of the dominant roster from back at DreamHack Atlanta, formerly Gale Force, and they ended up being the team that won RLCS Season 4. Oh, and then they also won Season 5, and part of their roster had won Season 3. Season 6 was on track to being somewhat lackluster again. Cloud9 making it to Worlds, but they're not really performing as they could have during the regional championships, and ultimately being sent directly down to the lower bracket by FLuuMP Girls. Interestingly enough, that was also an orgless team. Things were sort of coming full circle, and though Cloud9 had invested time and energy and certainly money into this roster, they weren't really getting what I'm sure they were hoping to get at this point, that shiny gold Rocket League trophy. But the season wasn't over, even though it kind of looked like it might have been. Cloud9 may have been sent to the lower bracket in the first round, but teams have made lower bracket runs before. Nothing is really impossible. Cloud9 then takes out Tainted Minds 3-0, and then NRG in overtime, Flipside Tactics, the Chiefs, and FLuuMP Girls, the team that actually sent them down to the losers bracket in the first round. And now we find Cloud9 facing off against their toughest opponents, which is Dignitas, a team that, well, they were basically the most dominant team in RLCS history. Still to this day, no team has had the success that they have had. Dignitas was undefeated this season through league play and through the regional playoffs and through the world championships, and all they had to do was win one series against a team that really didn't match up against them stylistically, and that was Cloud9. Cloud9 at this time, and especially during this tournament, they had a play style that kind of felt like a free-for-all. There was no second guessing anything. They gave each other space for lots of solo plays. It just wasn't rigid, it wasn't calculated, and often it honestly felt like it wasn't very team-based. I mean, they would do passing plays, but everything just felt kind of crazy, which is really the opposite of this Dignitas team. And sadly, the team that usually wins is the more rigid, structured team. That's especially been true in these later seasons of RLCS. But Cloud9 absolutely dominated Dignitas in this series and the second series as well, scoring loads of insane flip reset goals and double touches, and also causing Turbopolsa to get mad and hit his desk, or actually hit his chair. This was really the greatest underdog story in Rocket League esports history, maybe second to the first season where IBP just had everything going against them and they managed to win as well. But I'm guessing many of you already sort of know this story because this was really the height of this team and for this org's presence in the Rocket League scene. Cloud9 went on to do well in seasons after this, but something was sort of brewing, something was going wrong, and it really culminated in season 9. I do have to note though that Cloud9 did more than just win one RLCS. They won a lot of tournaments. They won DreamHack Valencia, for example, in 2019, and they also won Northern Arena. And they did do well at the RLCS World Championships and in league play, like to an extent, but the team just really wasn't playing at the level that they were used to. In Season 8 of RLCS, Cloud9 was absolutely dominated during league play, placing 7th and losing to teams that they just absolutely should not have lost to, and being forced down to the promotion playoffs versus the champions from RLRS. Alongside them were sort of the giants of G2, both teams having absolutely horrible seasons. Both teams were actually able to re-qualify for RLCS, and G2 actually really pulled things together as a team. They won the regional championships the next season, but Cloud9 placed 6th the next season. Now you probably already know this, but RLCS Season 9 Worlds was cancelled because of everything that has been going on in the world, and it's sad, but this is really where it all left off for this roster and for this org. The longest standing roster in Rocket League history. They were playing for an org that had never switched or traded or dropped any of them, and that's when the news hit this year, just a few months ago, that Cloud9 was leaving the Rocket League scene. Now this was huge news, and honestly really bad news. Amidst things like the Olympics being canceled, Rocket League was going to be at the Olympics, one of only 2 teams to be featured, the first esport to be at the Olympics, and then to have Cloud9, arguably the biggest, most mainstream team to be involved in Rocket League esports, just up and leave. It's just sad. So why did they leave and what happened? Well, apart from the team's failure to really perform consistently, especially in these later seasons, I just feel like there's got to be more to the story than just the team not playing well. The first thing I should note is that they could have dropped the roster altogether or dropped part of the roster if that was the problem, and maybe they offered that and the players just didn't want to split up, but they ultimately did split up anyways, so that wouldn't make sense. Like, why did Cloud9 leave when they could have picked up, say, a promising new roster or made some moves among the present roster to bring on a new person or just try something different? And there's another factor that complicates this even more, and that's the fact that multiple RLCS teams, including organizations like G2, Space Station Gaming, NRG, Vitality, basically every major org involved in the Rocket League scene, they all came together and signed a letter to Psyonix and to the esports program, basically complaining and asking for a bunch of changes. But one team was missing for that letter, and that was Cloud9, and obviously shortly after this, it was announced that they were leaving. Even though it's pretty well well known that they had had problems with the whole system of Rocket League esports and how it really didn't benefit orgs the way that other esports do. Now, that letter covered things like a lack of communication between the teams and Psyonix, as well as a problem with the current system of allowing the players to actually own their spot in RLCS versus the orgs having sort of more control. Basically, the orgs wanted more control and more influence in the scene, I think similar to the way other esports are. Also, orgs get virtually nothing from the scene, at least as it stood at that time. I'm not sure if things have changed in the past few months, but orgs basically make no money or virtually no money from the league. And I've also heard that there are problems with the whole esports decals and items and how much the orgs actually generate from that kind of stuff. All in all, these teams appeared to see enough hope for the scene to draft and sign this letter, while Cloud9 didn't get involved at all. They weren't signed on there, they weren't named at all, and I'm guessing the same problems were still true for them, they just didn't see any changes actually coming. Now, all of this happened, Cloud9 left just months before Psyonix announced that Rocket League is going free to play at the end of the summer. That's right, I've been asking for this alongside lots of other figures in the community, and Psyonix is actually doing it. They will be releasing Rocket League on the Epic Games platform completely free to play, and honestly, I'm so happy they're doing this now versus waiting until, it sort of is used as a marketing ploy after the game is maybe going downhill or maybe sales are going downhill. They're staying ahead of the curve and they're making a big and honestly a risky move, but it's the right move to make in my opinion. Now, this is actually huge for orgs because it will mean more sort of viewership and just more exposure for the game in general. And it's kind of sad because there's one org that's going to miss out on all of it, and that is Cloud9. Now, could they come back if they wanted to? Probably, but I doubt they will. Even if Rocket League does grow to its full potential, I don't know, I doubt we'll see them again. Currently, Cloud9's roster is split up, with Torment and Gimmick kind of on their own team, and Squishy getting picked up by NRG, and honestly playing amazing with this roster as I sort of figured that he would. All this to say that though the fall of Cloud9's Rocket League team was hard to watch and really sad for the esport and for the community, we'll all remember the good times, this incredible rise of Cloud9 from a nothing orgless team, managing to take down the giants of the scene and getting signed by one of the biggest orgs in the world, to ultimately winning the World Championship up against the most dominant team in Rocket League esports history. RLCS Season 6 was the first Rocket League event that I ever attended, and it was there that Cloud9 pulled off the most ridiculous comeback story in the history of the esport. This story of Cloud9 in the whole story of Rocket League esports is one that we will never forget. At least I know I won't forget it.